Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University.
This week in the news, rising rents add to college students' scramble for affordable housing. A tight housing market and a renewed desire for campus life have left some schools with long waiting lists for dorms. An article by Susan Svrluga of the Washington Post. The question from a listener is, how do you know if your student is overrepresented at a college? And our interview is Lisa interviews Dr. Louis Newman on his book, Thinking Critically in College. That's part 3 of 4. And our college spotlight is High Point University, part 2 of 2.
How's my brother from another mother?
Man, so much going on for the politics. I know your brother Norm is through the roof because the Denver Nuggets won the championship.
Through the roof. He's insufferable.
Absolutely.
And I have a family reunion coming up in July. I hope that it's wore off by then.
Well, I was going to tease him that I know that Denver can run a parade as well as Chicago now. Only a couple shootings and you ran over a cop with a fire truck.
Well, you know what? I'm claiming my steak dinner.
Chicago parade edition.
I'm about to claim my steak dinner, man, because I'll be with you from the 9th through 12th of July, counting down the days. That's really getting close. And I haven't forgot. You had the audacity to bet me that Herschel Walker would beat you can't remember our own senator. What's his name?
Did I say that? Anyway.
What's our senator's name? I'm losing it.
Raphael Warnock.
Oh boy, senior moment there. Not good. Yeah, so I'm going to claim my steak dinner, and Chicago's got some good steak, so I'm looking forward for that, and also getting to Loyola and Northwestern and Chicago and maybe DePaul. Dave, have you been hearing about DePaul's financial struggles? Have you read anything about that?
No. What's going on there?
$52.5 million budget shortage since 2018. So,
wow.
Well, yeah, we're going to be talking about it coming up here pretty soon in an article. But, man, I feel for them.
Enrollment?
I mean, it's the same trend we see, Dave. It's like the haves and the have-nots, you know? The flagships and the selective privates are doing well, and almost everybody else is struggling. Community colleges, regional publics, and less selective privates are just really having a hard time out there.
Well, not to steal a thunder, but I will tell you that I think one of the issues with DePaul and Loyola is you've got University of Chicago, Illinois, which is considerably less expensive. It's got a great commuter option, and it gives you a full suite of engineering, medical school, and law school graduate options that I think I would not be surprised if they are becoming a preferred destination for a lot of the local kids in Chicago now.
So I think there's truth to that. I see that everywhere. I know when, Lisa and I recently did a slew of North Carolina visits, and, when we're at Elon or High Point, they brought the same point up. Like, look, a lot of times it's a tough sell for us in North Carolina because of what people can pay to go to, the UNC system, right? But what those schools do is their bread and butter is out of state. So right. If you look at like High Point, Elon, they're just, raiding the New Jerseys and the Pennsylvanias and particularly for Elon, increasingly so for High Point, they're moving into, New England and doing really, really well. I see that with Loyola. I got a kid going into Loyola this year from Denver, another one from, Minnesota, and very strong interest in the junior class in a lot of places. So, Chicago is still really appealing. I think there's probably a little bit more going on with DePaul, because when John Bockenstedt was VP of Enrollment, they never had these issues. Like, that drop-off corresponds exactly when he left for the Oregon State job, which is why in some ways your VP of enrollments and admissions are really, really underpaid. Schools pay their football coaches all this money because they bring in revenue. But the person that's over the entire admission operation for your school, that is usually responsible for 90% of your entire operating budget, boy, getting the right person at the helm makes a big difference.
Well, DePaul has a lot of issues. I mean, we've talked for years how Chicago was such a recruiting powerhouse for high school basketball kids, and yet DePaul has not had a good program since Mark Aguirre.
So, Dave, we're really aging ourselves when we're talking Mark Aguirre and Terry Cummings and guys like this, man. This is like 1979, 80, dude. We're going way back.
Well, that tells you how bad DePaul's been.
I know. They really haven't. All right, Dave. Well, I'm going to jump in with my admissions tip. And the admissions tip this week is for students in any high school grade, other than the seniors that already know where they're going. But, I'm talking freshmen, sophomores, juniors. So keep a log of how you spend your time for 2 weeks in the summer, 2 weeks in the fall, 2 weeks in the winter, 2 weeks in the spring. And the reason for that is it's really going to help you when you have to complete the section of the application. And this is true for all applications, Coalition, UC App, Common App. They all have sections where they ask, they want to know how you spent your time in high school. A lot of times they'll use the word activities, which I hate. I prefer the word commitments. What were your commitments? Because that's really what they want to know. They really want to know how you spent your time. This is going to help you in a couple ways. One, you're going to be able to do better projections of the actual amount of time you actually spent on these things. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, it will surface things that should be on your list that you might not think of being on your list, because people have a tendency to think of very structured activities because of that word activities. Whereas if they use the word commitments, it would bring in the things that should be included in there. Like if you work on your guitar playing an hour every day on your own in your room, that should be included in there. If you spend an hour and a half lifting weights, going to the gym, that should be included in there. You're working on trying to get your black belt in karate, that should be included in there. Schools want to know about your commitments, not just your activities. And people can miss that because they're in the structured activity mindset. But when they actually record their time and they go back and look at a log, it will surface things that should be included in there that can go fly under the radar. And it can also allow you to make more accurate projections when it asks you how much time you actually spend on these commitments. Does that make sense, Dave?
It does. It does. And it reminds me that life is about a series of learning experiences, and commitments sort of helps you focus that whatever you're doing, you can learn from it, and it can add to that experience and add to your sense of where you want to go. We've talked about people who've done amazing essays on working at Starbucks or working at a 9-to-5 job, and how it might have gave them insight on relationships and people, or entrepreneurial insights, or so forth. So I like the idea of commitments because it adds the sense that whatever you do, try and do it well, gain insight from it, and let it be a stepping stone to sort of making you more angular and figure out how this sort of fits into your vision of yourself and your future.
Yeah, and that's the perspective from the applicant. I'll give you the perspective from the college. So this is what I tell the students that I work with. There's two major reasons why your commitments are really important to a college. One, when an admission officer opens a file, first and foremost, they're trying to figure out who this person is. And where you spend your time is a great insight into who you are. The second thing you're trying to figure out is, what is this student going to bring to our community? And while just like in investing, past performance is no guarantee of future success, past involvements are no guarantee that's what you'll do in college. It's the best thing they have to go on. If you're the kid who's always involved in service, then there's a good chance you're going to find some service clubs at our college and plug in there. And I can see you now in our college context, and I can picture where you may get plugged in. Of course, you have the right to change your mind, but in terms of probabilities, it's the best probability I have to go on. If you're the kid who plays 3 sports and you're not good enough to play on our varsity team, there's a good chance you'll get involved in our intramural or our club sports. That's the perspective a college is going to have. So as I'm trying to, 1, get to know you better, reading your file, and 2, trying to project your impact on our campus, going to where you spent your time, that's really the best thing I have to go on. So that's kind of the admission officer perspective.
Makes sense.
All right. Admissions vernacular, and the word is support. And you're like, really, Stuck? Are you going to insult my intelligence and try to tell me what the word support is? Well, support in an admissions context is used in an athletic recruiting context. And what it refers to is whether or not the coach wants you on the team. So if you have support from the coach, it means the coach will advocate for you to the admission office that you're an athlete that can help us, and we'd like to see you on the campus. If you're trying to get into a school as an athlete, and you might have all the academic criteria, but the coach doesn't want you, then you're not going to get through the athletic recruitment process. They may tell you, and I have to have, every year I have this happen, if you can get it on your own, you can, they use different language, but there'll probably be a spot for you, or there's a good chance you'll be able to walk on, that kind of language. But support, it refers to, I want this player on the team. I'm putting my name behind them. And admissions, now go do your thing and let me know whether or not they're acceptable. Now, I'm particularly talking about Division III, and I'm talking about like higher academic Division I schools like Patriot, Ivy, stuff like that. There are sports where schools just have slots, and you don't have to go through this admission process. The coach gets a number of slots, and as long as you're an academic qualifier, you're in. Support is still applies because you still have to have support of the coach. But I'm talking about the process of the coach giving you support. Now it goes to the admission office. In many Division I sports, coaches get slots, and if someone's an academic qualifier, support automatically means they're in and they got the scholarship.
Right.
Was that clear or confusing, Dave?
No, I think it's clear. So, I mean, just to clarify, for a lot of Division I scholarship schools, let's say Mike Krzyzewski is going to have whichever 10 students that meet the minimum requirements that he needs to make his team a championship contender. But that's different from a lot of Division III schools that may not have athletic scholarships per se, but where the coach can clearly indicate, I want this kid on the team. So maybe it's not a scholarship spot, but it's definitely a definite clue to the admissions committee that this is a special athlete that has special consideration.
Yeah, because what happens is, and we're getting into the weeds here, but hopefully people find this interesting. What happens is there's a maximum number of spots that you can have by NCAA regulation. Okay. But also, and particularly you'll see this come into play for most sports, which are non-revenue producing. We know most sports are being carried by the football and basketball programs, and sometimes in places like, Iowa now and UConn, Notre Dame, Stanford, some places women's basketball and occasionally baseball, but mostly football and basketball really support. And a few places hockey is a revenue generator, but not very many. But basketball and football mostly support the whole academic enterprise or the whole athletic enterprise, right? So what can happen in these non-revenue producing sports at Division III and Division II, I've seen it a lot at Division II as well. You have your maximum number of slots that you're allowed by the NCAA, but then the college might come in with a lower number. So let's say, there's a provision for 8 spots, and then the school comes in and says you got 4, because from their standpoint, that could be revenue, and you particularly see that a lot actually in Division II. But also in Division III, you can see it as well, because there's other compositional diversity goals that schools have, and they may not necessarily want to allocate all of them to sports. I'll give you an example. So I was at Vanderbilt 2 days last week, both on the 5th and the 9th of June. And one question somebody asked, because it was with 45 counselors, and they said, how many spots do you give away to athletes? So Dave, Vanderbilt has 1,600 kids that come into their freshman class every year.
Yeah.
How many spots do you think are earmarked for athletes?
Well, I know that for many schools that are Division III, up to 25 to 30% of the spots could be for
So
athletes.
first of all, Vanderbilt's in the SEC, so they're Division I. And,
right, okay.
And those 25 to 30, those tend to be those 2,000 person really small schools.
Correct. So I'm going to say for Vandy, I'd say about 15 to 20%.
90 spots go to athletes out of 1,600. 90.
Just 90?
90. Less than, what figure, do the math on that.
That's not even the football team. How's that possible?
Well, remember, that's the football team over 4 years. So football maybe gets 20 or 25, and, you do your basketball. And it's interesting because having a conversation with a swimmer who I'm working with, who, Vandy's one of the possible schools, and Vandy just basically let her know that, it's not a sport where we're going to allocate spots for. If you can get it on your own, you can be on the team. So there are a lot of schools that will limit the spots that the coaches get just because they have other compositional diversity goals.
Now, is Vandy on the low end of the SEC? I mean, if you were to...
Oh, of course. First of all, Vandy's on the low end on a lot of things, except for academic firepower. But first of all, it's the smallest SEC school by far, right? And then almost all the other SEC schools are public, not private.
Right.
And they just have much, much, much bigger athletic programs and athletic budgets. I mean, huge, ridiculous, crazy budgets at most of your SEC teams. So that also explains why Vandy's in the loss column a lot on marquee sports like football and basketball. But there's enough of a pull academically that they're going to do well in. There are a lot of people that are happy to go play, golf or swimming or something and get a Vandy education. And they do well in baseball. But anyway, so don't make this all. I'm not trying to make it all about sports. Yeah. Let's get to the big number. So this is a recent article in the Chronicle for Higher Ed. And right now and we're going to be discussing this article coming up the next month. Right now, of high school graduates, 55% of males are going to college, and 70% of women are going to college. So take your choice, Dave. The big number could be 70 or it could be the 15 percentage point gap between men and women. Either one, big number.
Yeah, that can have catastrophic consequences. It is having but that's another today. But that's a very distressing gap.
Yeah, I mean it's 55. I guess you could say it could be under the majority, but it certainly leads to challenges. I wouldn't go so far as to say catastrophic, but I'll say it certainly leads to unique challenges on college campuses.
To put it in another way, how does that translate into the ratios of male to female on campus? It's got to be 60-40 now, right?
It is. That's the national numbers right now, 60-40. And it would be even more, but that's with an extra thumb on the scale for the boys in most places. That's what takes it down to that gap, when you really would be looking at probably a 15 percentage point gap if there wasn't, a little bit more attention to trying to lessen that gap by putting a little bit extra thumb on the scales. And it's not talked about that much, but it's a reality in most schools. Of course, there's exceptions, places like engineering certain majors continue to be overrepresented on the male side, but across the board, that's what we're looking at. But listen, Dave, we have an exciting article today. I specifically picked it for you because you're the real estate mogul.
That's right. I understand this well.
I know we're talking about your world here. So why don't you give your always excellent description of the article to our listeners, and then they'll know what we're talking about. We'll dive into it.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Well, this is an article by Susan Svrluga. And Susan, I hope I got your last name right. If not, please text Mark of the Washington
They've
Post.
asked me before, how do I pronounce it? I'm like, I don't know.
That's right. Let Mark know. And that's Rising Rents Add to College Students Scramble for Affordable Housing. Subtitled, A Tight Housing Market and a Renewed Desire for Campus Life Has Left Some Schools with Long Waiting Lists for Dorms. So basically, it talks about how surging rental costs and a greater demand for traditional campus housing after the disruptions of the COVID pandemic have left students scrambling to find housing this year. And at schools struggling with long lists for using university housing, efforts to accommodate students have led to some unusual solutions. So, as a bit of a backstory, as we all know, the COVID pandemic of the last several years interrupted normal work, and people spent more time at home. There was a huge work from home movement. And many people, as a result, moved from the cities and the inner cities to the suburbs and the exurbs for more space. Quickly, there were more people that were looking to buy homes than were homes available. And as a result, home prices soared nationwide. Because of that, many prospective homeowners were not able to buy and they became renters. So as a result, rents rose higher. Add to this, the global supply chain disruptions made constructing new rental units be increasingly delayed. And because of that gap in uncertainty, many housing units that would have been built in 2019, 2020 were not started or were delayed until more economic certainty arose. So as a result, at some campuses, not all, but at some, housing issues have become acute. So this article talks about several of the schools and how they adjusted. I first have talked about Cal Berkeley. And Cal Berkeley now has a situation where the state is frantically trying to pour money into building a whole lot of student housing after Cal Berkeley's increasing enrollment drove many students to try and rent in the surrounding community. As a result, many residents were not able to find housing, and this actually led to a court order that capped enrollment at Cal Berkeley until they were able to figure out the situation. That court order was later overturned, but not before a lot of drama and strong with the university and a lot of concerns about where they were going to house these students. UCLA is now guaranteeing all incoming freshmen will have campus housing for the last 4 years. But to give you an idea of how disruptive this were, this article talks about that in the last couple of years, there were students living in illegal subleases. There were students living in garages. There were even students sleeping on parked cars in the street. And it was common to have up to 13 students in one house. So California is just starting to get on top of this issue, but because of the acute housing shortage, it's really been a mess in both Northern and Southern California in the last couple of years. I talked about Virginia Commonwealth University, where as a result of a lot of students struggling to pay rent, they had to use a lot of their student loans that were supposed to cover the tuition and fees to help cover the rent. And so as a result, there's been a lot of crises and gaps in student living expenses because they've had to divert so much to living costs. And also in the Richmond area, a lot of the students have had to live in areas that were considered much too unsafe for typical students. At Florida Atlantic University, many more students were asking to live on campus because the rents in the surrounding area literally doubled in the last 15 months. and they now currently have a wait list of 800 students waiting for campus housing. The school has responded by offering more of their classes online to let students learn away from the campus as they try and grapple with this crisis. And at the University of Utah, the wait lists for housing exceeded 3,500 students this spring. So the university did a couple of interesting things. In the interim, they're subletting an apartment building owned by nearby Westminster College and using that for student housing. And they're planning to use 300 rooms at an on-campus hotel for student housing. They've also come up with a very interesting plan where they're launching a pilot program to connect students with graduates and alumni from as far as 45 miles away, and actually paying those alumni and students to house these students in their extra rooms in these houses. So I'm going to stop there, Mark, but just say that, they also talked about New York City, where, my sister Kim is a real estate agent there. And what essentially happened was people moved out of the city, rents crashed. A lot of people moved in to take advantage of those rents. And when the students came back finally to be on campus, they found out that many of their student housing was occupied for people who took advantage of the generous rents, and that there weren't any rents available. And furthermore, that a lot of the housing that was in the works in 2019, 2020, 2021 got delayed and pushed back, and now everybody's playing catch up. I do believe that this situation is going to basically sort itself out over the next couple of years, but the fact is right now, kids are paying a premium for housing.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about this. The idea first got percolating in my mind when one of the members of our listening family from Michigan sent in this great article on the housing shortage at the University of Miami. And I was actually going to go with that article, but as I start doing my research, I like this article because it spoke to such a breadth of colleges and didn't focus on one school. I mean, we've talked about the housing shortage before, particularly at Berkeley. We've done a whole in the news on that. We've talked about it before for UCSB, Santa Barbara, and Miami. But this article brings in so many more schools, like it talks about Florida Atlantic and Virginia Commonwealth and NYU and Howard and Utah. And, you've got this confluence of factors going on. You have real estate prices going up precipitously across the country, exponentially. And especially in certain like high demand areas, certainly coastal areas and certain major metropolitan areas. And then if you have a culture where a large percentage of your students live off campus, it's just driving them out of the price range of making it affordable. And so this is a real problem. And Dave, I wanted to talk to you because not only do you have real estate, I know you rent to a lot of students in Chicago. So talk about it from your like, what are you seeing? And I know this, Dave won't say this, but Dave's often been really generous, and he'll give students a pass for a month or make them pay half price or something when he sees them struggling. So he's one of these kind landlords, even that I try to bust his chops over here and give him a hard time on air. He actually has a very big heart because he'll tell me about these struggling students who can't pay their rent and how he tries to work with them. But what's your experience as someone who has real estate and rents to a lot of students in Chicago?
Well, ironically, what's happened in Chicago is, in my particular area, many of the students have been priced out. Chicago is experiencing a shortage of affordable housing as well. And what's also happened was, in the Chicago housing voucher system, in the pandemic, they literally increased the rents like 20, 30%. They designated our area where we rent to students as an opportunity zone. And what that means is they were trying to get landlords to rent to more CHAs, to more government voucher holders. And to do that, they literally hiked the incentives to rent so high that it made it almost impossible to reject the offers the government was sending us. So, for example, in 2018, 2019, many of my 3-bedroom units were renting for $1,600, $1,700, $1,800. In 2021 and 2020, they started to increase the voucher amounts for many of the Section 8 housing to $2,200, $2,300. We had rental increases of $200-$300 occurring in a single year. And many students who were used to paying, $400, $500, $600 per student, all of a sudden had them looking at $700, $800. And so many of them, a lot of our students were UIC students that's a big commuter campus. So a lot of them moved back home. Some of them tried to double up. So instead of having 3 people to a 3 flat, they were trying to get 3 or 4 or 5. But, we try and limit that. But as a result, I think we've gone from having 30 to 40% students to less than 10%. And it's a big problem because it's also driven out a lot of the middle class people who are managers of Starbucks or Home Depot or 2-worker families who simply can't afford that. And so we see what's happening in Chicago and New York City is that it's bifurcating into a situation where you're either extremely wealthy and you can pay $3,000-$4,000 a month for a 2-bedroom, or you have some type of government assistance. But a lot of the solid middle, which includes students, have simply been priced out of the market. So this is a huge problem. In Chicago, it's similar, I think, in a lot of cities like New York City and San Francisco.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I thought this was an important article is more than just intellectual curiosity, FYI, I just want you to know, this is something that I feel families need to think of when they're looking at a college.
Yeah.
If you want your student to be on campus all 4 years, then one thing you should look for is, does your campus guarantee on-campus housing for all 4 years?
Yeah.
I'll comment on something in the article and then I'll juxtapose that with a different mindset. So one of the things that the article talks about is how UCLA has secured additional housing and they now can guarantee housing for all 4 years. Okay, now let's juxtapose that with what the University of Utah is doing. I'm going to read this from the article. At the University of Utah, the wait list for housing exceeded 3,500 students this spring. University officials are planning new residential buildings, but took several interim steps this summer to ease the gap. Now, one thing it says is they're launching a pilot program to connect students with graduates, check this out, as far as 45 miles away from campus who are willing to provide housing. The university will charge a flat $5,000 per semester fee to students and pay that to alumni for rooms or apartments in their homes. Now, that is not realistic or practical for a student to be 45 miles away in order to get their housing. Like, that completely uproots your whole campus experience and impacts other things like study groups and extracurriculars and things you want to get involved in. It necessitates a need for a car or public transportation, which could be inconsistent or could take a long time to do, or expensive Ubers or something. So that is just not a quality of life situation to stay 45 minutes away in an alumni home. So I would say, like, if it's important to you to have a residential experience for 4 years, as a parent, you should be looking at that. Do you guarantee housing for all 4 years? Now, there's the opposite scenario. Let's say you say, well, I don't want to stay on campus for all 4 years. I probably want to be on for 2, off for 2. Well, then it necessitates you doing the research to look at what is that cost structure going to be. Because being off campus could mean one of 2 things. It could mean you're living in a garage or you're being jammed in, 13 kids in. I mean, I realize these are extreme exceptions, but you're in a shoebox of a room and still paying an exorbitant fee. Or you go for something a little nicer that might be more comfortable and get ready to dig deep into your pockets and have you plan for that as you assess expenses. So either way, whether you're the person who sees your student off campus or on campus, to me, this topic has relevance for how you assess the schools on your students list when it comes to housing. Thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, and I agree with everything you're saying, and I really want to stress, for me, it's affordable housing, and that's the key. It's affordable housing. If I look what's being built, there's stuff being built in New York, there's stuff being built in Chicago. It's just crazy expensive. And it's like we're dividing truly into, I hate to say it, but this whole rich poor analogy. These apartment complexes that are designed to have fitness clubs and bars and Starbucks in the lobby and concierge
Movie
service,
theaters. Yeah.
movie theaters. There, we went to a friend's place. He rents in Chicago. Beautiful 3-bedroom, view of the lake, amazing fitness center, everything. He pays $7,500 a month in rent, and that's for a
Wow.
3-bedroom. The first floors, the 1-bedrooms are going for $4,000, and they're like sold out because there's a demand for that, and that's what they're building. That's not what a student needs. Meanwhile, there are students that they need places for $400 or $500 a month that they can get together with 3 or 4 students and basically cobble together and live in a place. It may not be great. It's not going to have any concierge of everything, but it's going to be 4 walls in a relatively safe area, which is also key with the rise in crime in many of these cities. Those places are incredibly hard to find, and that's not what they're building. So if you're in a place like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, that's the problem. And I suspect that a lot of these student dorms that are going to be built, they're costly. So I wouldn't be surprised if you have another perceptible rise in tuition, living expenses to subsidize a lot of these dorms because of the cost of housing. So that's my concern, affordable housing.
Yeah, and we talk about a lot of things when we talk about transitioning to college, and we talk about cost a lot too, but sometimes we don't get down into the minutia. We don't get into the weeds. We don't get into the nitty gritty. We talk about things like look at the cost of attendance and your student aid index or your expected family contribution and your potential for scholarship money. But the thing is, schools use different approaches when they come to calculating those costs of attendance, especially for non-billable expenses, which are not paid directly to the bursary, right? Bursar's office. So you're talking about surveys is oftentimes what they do, surveys of their students to see what their actual costs are for some of these off-campus expenses like books and transportation and off-campus living. It's been my experience that sometimes those numbers are woefully inadequate. Woefully inadequate. In fact, I've had some parents that have challenged them with data and gone back to, and in one case, I know we literally got the numbers changed. It's not like it's a bait and switch, like someone's trying to get over on you. It's just sometimes their survey data may be old and they may be, may be outdated, or it may not be based on where you want to stay. Like sometimes if you as a student are coming from a pretty comfortable lifestyle, with a lot of amenities and maybe a really nice house and a really big room, and that's what you want for your college experience, you can't look at those cost of attendance projections, especially in expensive markets, and think they're anywhere close to what you're going to have to pay to get the lifestyle that you're used to if that's something that, you're expecting to have in college. And so the onus is really on the individual to assess what the housing cost is going to be in their respective markets and not necessarily rely on the projections that you'll see if you look at what will often be on a website for projected non-billable costs. And that's also true for other things too. Like sometimes I'll see transportation in a line item and it'll say $1,107. And I'll be working with a family and I'll say, okay, your student is probably going to take 4 round trip tickets and you're probably going to come at least twice.
Right. And
then you're going to have your hotels when you come. So you're talking $4,000 to $5,000 for you. So you can't use that 1,107 number as a line item over here. So, I mean, this can pertain to other aspects of non-billable costs as well, but certainly housing is really, really, really the big nut.
Yes, and in certain markets too, what's also driven out the costs is, especially if you're in some of the southern markets or in some of the key cities, is Airbnb. I've seen a lot of situations where things that would have been student housing has switched to Airbnb, and the problem with Airbnb is the whole cost. I mean, it's essentially turning an apartment into a hotel, and you just can't compete with Airbnb in terms of the cash flow situation. If something has Airbnb potential, then it's lost to the student market forever. You just
No, that's a good point. It's a good point. The role Airbnb has played in creating a shortage of available ongoing monthly housing was because people are turning them into, in effect, hotels and making money at that level, and the price that they can charge is just going to put the student right out of the market, and that's going to reduce the supply, and then that's going to drive the cost up in a supply and demand world, driving prices.
That's right. If you're in Utah and you're close to a ski resort, it ain't going to be student housing.
Well, Dave, I think we've covered this. I think the takeaways are to several things. I would say would be takeaways. One is if you want 4-year residential, see if your school commits to that. Most schools don't, but a lot of schools will commit to first-year students having a place on campus. Some schools can't even commit to that. They don't even have the housing even to commit to providing housing for first-year students. I am a big believer on trying to stay on campus for at least the first couple of years. And if you're not on campus, being extremely close to campus. And there's a lot of research that shows GPAs, graduation rates, retention, all that data is a lot higher if you stay on campus or if you're very close to campus, because the academic epicenter of the school is by the school. And whether that's study groups or opportunity to reach professors or just accessing the library or just being in that sort of academic milieu. Once you start getting off campus, away from campus, all the magnetic pull is away from things academic.
And I would echo too that, I mean, if you're going to a major city on the Northeast or the coasts, it's so much easier to know your expenses up front by going on campus. To go to a New York or a Boston or a DC or a Miami and not know what your housing is before you commit to the bottom line, it can completely blow your budget projections. So, if you want to know exactly how much college is going to cost, factor in campus housing from the get-go. It's extremely stressful to be there in August knowing you have 3 weeks to find a place to stay. It may not be possible in many of these cities at this time. So,
yeah, and one other thing is just clarity between parents and students. So it's crystal clear, and there's no imprecise communication when it comes to who's paying what. Right. Because everybody's got different arrangements. One parent would be, don't worry about it, I've got it, you can stay where you want, don't worry about this, I don't want that on your mind. Another parent could say, you're living on campus. Another parent could say, you can live off campus, but this is how much you're getting from me, and anything else you're on your own.
Oh, and to that point, I must add that please, students have to recognize that it can be quite a complex thing, especially in cities like New York, because if you have to have your students involved, your parents involved, they have to be co-signers. At places like New York City, that means that your parents are submitting a host of financial information, including their tax returns and their pay stubs and their credit reports and the sheer paperwork involved in signing a lease as a student with your parents and their roommates' parents as co-signers is a nightmare. So a lot easier to sign a campus contract than it is to try and get a student lease with parent co-signers in a lot of these places.
Yeah, and I've done that. I've been a parent co-signer for my kids. So, sometimes it's the right move, but you just need to make sure that's something you're comfortable with.
Right.
Because if you sign as a co-signer and something happens, you're on it's basically you're committed to that 100% of it.
And not only that, you're committed not just if it's multiple people on the lease, your parents are actually co-signing not just for your liability, but for your roommate's liability. If they don't pay, it's called joint and several liability. So it's not just on you many times with these leases. So pay attention.
That's why I had the real estate man do this episode, man. Bringing all this nuance and context to the table.
Yeah. How many times I've had two, you have three students and one leaves, and then the others are shocked when it says, well, what are we going to do with his rent? It says, you got to pay. And you'll get some angry parent going, I didn't realize I'm responsible for this other roommate's rent. It's called joint and several liability. Yes, you are.
I said Dave is kind, but he's no pushover.
No.
Well, thank you, my friend, and I'll see you in a few weeks.
Awesome.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Lisa, you want to just dive right in? We have a question from Leslie.
Right. Yeah.
Hi there. My name is Leslie, and I was listening to your newest podcast, April 19th, about overrepresentation. How do you know if you're overrepresented at a certain college? Also, I wanted to ask about minority. Are Middle Eastern ethnicities considered minority? Thank you.
So Leslie wants to know, how do you know if you're overrepresented? And I actually really like this question because we've never been asked it before. And I'm sure a lot of people are wondering it. And then she also wants to know, are Middle Eastern students considered minority? Right. So let's kind of take both of them together.
That's a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah. So you are going to be considered a person of color because that's just a definitional thing that has been established.
Can I say something, though? I don't know if because I worked with a student through Scholar Match who was Moroccan.
Yeah.
And there was no place for us to indicate that because North Africans are considered white by the United States Census, as are people of Middle Eastern descent. So, and there is no ethnic category that you can click on that. So I don't know if they'll, if they're not going to just automatically, from being able to fill out the Common App, be considered a person of color. You have to kind of probably indicate that elsewhere in your application.
Well, that's a good point. You had a specific experience with that. I do know in general, schools want what they don't have, and unique types of diversity are going to be valued. And I think you're mostly, when someone says, are you a minority, you're really kind of asking, is that diversity seen as beneficial in admissions? I'm sure it's mostly a proxy for that. But Lisa's point is well taken. If you don't communicate it, then they won't know. But back to the main question that you asked, how do you know if you're overrepresented? So I think what's helpful here is to look at some of the main ways in which colleges bucket kids. And if you think that way, right? So what are some of those main ways? One is gender, one is geography, social class. And when I mean social class, the way that actually plays itself out in the context of admissions, social class can mean Pell recipients, first gen, or it can mean full pay, high pay. So that's what I mean by social class, right? All of that. And so schools, they're never really going to come right out and tell you what their goals are or what they see as balanced, but that's kind of considered pretty much inside baseball. No, that's just information they'll keep close to the vest. But they are going to have target goals for that because that impacts budget, and that's also a component of diversity. And then the other thing is going to be major for schools that look at major, and then race. So those would really be the big things. Am I missing anything, Lisa? That's what gender, geography, social class, like all aspects of it, first gen, major, and race. Ethnicity. So those are the big things that came to my mind when I thought of this. Anything else you can think of? Sexual orientation?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how schools would do that.
Well, it's not so much that they have goals. It's more the concept of, for schools that are trying to be as diverse as possible,
and all aspects of diversity. If they see something that they feel they don't have a lot of, they may feel like that's a voice that could add something. But still, it is a little different because it's not necessarily something that I think they would have goals or objectives for. Like there might be an objective to try to be 50-50 in our engineering program by gender or something like that. So that's a little obfuscated, and I can understand that. But I cut you off. Are you going to say something?
Oh, I guess I was just thinking about your tuba players, your, like just filling those buckets of activities and talents that they wanted to be diverse.
That's worth mentioning. I have a feeling that's not probably what Leslie's asking in this question, but it's worth noting that that's all a component of what schools need to do, and bringing in a balanced class is athletes, artists. So how do you know? Well, there's a couple of ways you can know. And in some cases, to be honest, you don't know. But you can get the gender information and just look at, that's like available in places like Common Data Set and all kinds of other places that pre-populate from Common Data Set. As far as states, that information is available. I used to have a real go-to source for that. I used to get that off of CAPEX website, and it's been harder for me to get now. But you can still get that information and see where students are coming from. As far as the financial, that's a little trickier because you may not know what they consider balanced or what their internal goals are. Because there's a school that just wants more full pay families, or they're need aware. And so they're looking for people that can pay. And then there's another school that's trying to get more first gen, more Pell. So that's a little trickier other than reading. The best thing you have to do usually is look at the breakdown of last year's class. And especially know that that's kind of forms somewhat of a comparison tool. They're always comparing their next class to the one before. And they're trying to be more diverse than they were before. Or if they feel like they're imbalanced in some area, they're trying to move toward balance. And so that's the best thing you have to go on. Now, if you're in touch with the school and you're listening to them, and sometimes you read the literature and look at things sometimes, that are everything from presidential addresses to things that might even be in strategic plans, sometimes you'll hear them indicate what some of their priorities are when they're explicit. But that's a lot to ask if you're looking at a lot of schools to go doing all that digging. So the reality is sometimes it's easy to tell, sometimes it's harder to tell. But in general, like with geography, the closer you are to the school, the more you're probably overrepresented. And with gender, you could just look at those numbers, but sometimes you need to look at gender by major to get a sense for that. It is an important question, though, because what spawned this question, I made the comment, if you're overrepresented, you need to take that into consideration in building your college list. Right? So like a lot of schools, let's say in the Northeast, they're going to be overrepresented with people from the Northeast. Because most people still do look for colleges, within a few hours of their home. So geographically, you're usually overrepresented if you're looking at a school that's close to where you're going, and especially if you're in an area that has a huge surge of people looking at that area. So that's the geographic, piece. For gender, a lot of times that really boils down to like majors, because some majors are like fashion design is heavily female, and then some like comp sci engineering heavily male, and then liberal arts schools that don't have like engineering and football, they usually have populations that really tilt female. So some of it's just intuitive if you kind of know that stuff. I'd say the money was one of the harder ones in general, like to actually know. In general, though, schools are looking for people that can pay. That's not something they'll talk about a lot. In general, if you can pay versus if you need a lot for a private school, that's usually going to be an asset to you in this process. Like you can work off of that as an assumption in most instances. It's usually just the wealthiest of the wealthy that are really striving to really increase their underrepresented numbers with real aggression. A lot of them are giving lip service and talk about it, but I mean, actually putting a plan in place to do something about it, that just requires a lot. I was having a conversation with an admission officer recently about diversity.
and their attempt to become more diverse, which is something the representative really feels strongly about. And one thing that the representative said to me is, it just takes so much money to do it. Just takes so much money. It's just really hard when you're going up against like people with much deeper pockets. So I don't know. I feel like I'm doing all the talking on this. Lisa, anything you want to add?
Oh, well, I feel like my experience with my student who was North African and had no money, she would get like waitlisted because she needed a lot of aid. And, it was a bit of a discouraging process. I also wanted to say that I do think that there is movement to change the U.S. Census and how they collect data and to put a Middle Eastern North African box that you can check there, and hopefully that should solve that. Because right now I was kind of reading some articles where it's like, it's like the white being treated as white but without the privilege, right? And so I would just encourage Leslie to have her student really try to emphasize that unique special part of their life on the application, because they won't be able to check any boxes about it.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting question. We've talked about this before. There's schools that want diversity primarily because of exposing people to different cultures, stretches in, everybody's outlook. And then there's people that want the photo op, or they want something that shows up in the numbers. And so you've actually followed this closer than I have, Lisa. I actually didn't realize that there wasn't a place for that.
Well, I didn't realize it till we started filling out the Common App last year. I'm like, wait, what? How is there no checkbox? It just never even occurred to me. So that's when I started looking into it.
I mean, I've had other students before, but I guess I just wasn't consciously aware. So I appreciate your contributions on that. So in summary, for gender, you can just look it up. Assume colleges want to be close to 50-50 if it's a school that looks at gender. The UCLAs of the world don't look at gender. For your geographic diversity, if you can't get it online, ask for the students by state breakdown. And if you can access that, just know you can see what's overrepresented and what's not by those numbers. If you're unable to access that, just know that most of the time schools within a few hour radius of the school are going to be overrepresented. And the farther away you go, especially for smaller, more distinct states, they'll be underrepresented. For major, plenty of places that list most popular majors, and know that when you see the most popular majors, that's going to be overrepresented. Sometimes for first gen or Pell, schools share these schools. They're not going to share for full pay or high pay. That's just seen as proprietary information, offensive and gauche, so you're not going to get that. For race, you can look up racial demographics and compare that to national averages, and often schools want to mirror America, so if you see you're overrepresented or underrepresented compared to national averages, there's a good sense you can use that as a guide to see, if you're overrepresented that way. Once again, that's for schools who look at race as one factor amongst many, and there's 10 right now that don't, and the Supreme Court ruling, there may be a whole lot more pretty soon. Well, hopefully we gave you some pointers, Leslie. Point you in the right direction. Thanks for sending in your question.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, hopefully you've enjoyed Lisa's interview with Dr. Lewis Newman on thinking critically in college. In part 3 of 4, Dr. Newman talks about the value of study groups at deepening your learning and clarifying your thinking. He gives great advice on how to pick courses to deepen your learning. And Lisa and Lewis talk about some of the most common mistakes students make. And then Dr. Newman makes a compelling case for the value of the humanities, courses like philosophy, that can really teach you how to think. Listen and enjoy.
You also have some other suggestions to promote student success. Can you outline a few of those?
Sure. I include in between these chapters that I really focused on critical thinking, what I call advice for the road ahead, which are just little 2 to 3 page tidbits of advice about how to approach your college education in general. And some of them are things like adopting a growth mindset. That's a concept that, again, a lot of people in psychology are familiar with. Carol Dweck at Stanford, I think, pioneered the research on this. And basically what that means is simply, we all face setbacks in life. And if every time you hit a setback, you feel discouraged and demoralized, and it reinforces for you a sense that you're incompetent, or you're failing, or you can't get it, or you don't know how to learn, or whatever negative message you draw from that setback, you're essentially shooting yourself in the foot. And if by contrast you develop I made a mistake. What can I learn from that? Next time I can learn to do better. And you look forward with a more positive attitude and recognize that setbacks are just an essential and inevitable part of the learning process. You will use those setbacks as stepping stones to continue to grow and develop. So if you can focus on developing a growth mindset, it will serve you well throughout your college career. Another example, I talk about joining a team. A lot of students are accustomed to trying to do things on their own, being independent learners, and there's nothing wrong with independence. But in college, there are a lot of times when you're going to be required to do group work, group projects. But even if you're not required to, you may well find that it's useful to join a study group and work together, because, two minds are better than one, and three or four minds are better than two. And it's not only that the collective brain power is useful, it's that sometimes when you're in a situation like that and you try to explain something to somebody else, the very process of trying to say it out loud and then have somebody else say to you, well, I didn't quite understand what you meant by that, helps you clarify your own thinking. So there's actually a process of deepening your own learning just in the process of working it out together. So that's another little piece of advice, is that sometimes pay attention to the possibilities that come from working with others. Another example is a little piece that I call taking risks. So every student who comes to college has familiarity with English and history and and math and some science of various kinds and so on. Right? Those subjects are all going to be taught in college, and you can sort of just gravitate to the things that you've already studied and the things that you know well and that you know you're good at. And that's not bad. There's nothing, you can get a great college education, sort of playing it safe, if you will. But I encourage students in the book to take some risks, to move outside of your comfort zone, to try something new. At Carleton, early on, I came across, there's a piece of advice that supposedly some Carleton older student had given to a younger student. I don't know if this actually happened or not, or if this is just a myth. But the piece of advice was, every term, take one course you're required to take, one course you'd love to take, and one course you never in a million years dreamed you'd take. And that last piece is the piece that a lot of students don't immediately gravitate to. They're worried about their GPA. They're worried about, how am I going to do in this thing? I don't know anything about it. But that's often the place where your learning deepens the most. You expand your horizons. You discover that you're interested in things you never even knew you were interested in.
Exactly.
And college is a great opportunity for that. And I encourage students to seize that opportunity, because you're not going to get it again in quite the same way. You're never again likely to be in a place where at your doorstep you could take classes in subjects so diverse and taught by experts in those fields that are so easy to access. So I think that's an opportunity that college offers that I encourage students to take advantage of. So in any case, those are just some of the little tidbits of advice that I think, based on my own experience teaching and advising students over the years. Lots of students, for example, I taught religious studies. As I said, a lot of students looked at that and said, "Oh, religion. Oh, I went to Sunday school. I hated it. I'm not going to take a religion class." not realizing that religious studies in college is nothing at all like Sunday school.
Right.
Right. And so, in a way, they cut themselves off from the opportunity to learn things that they would have probably found really quite interesting. Anyway, so that's just one example.
Yeah, no, I think that those are all really great points. And again, you're making something explicit that, is kind of implicit. Like, I'm so glad that people are talking about the growth mindset and they've said, there's a language around that because I think, a lot of times we feel like we're not supposed to make any mistakes. We're supposed to be perfect. And if we're not perfect, then we're doing it wrong. And then you're trying to hide that. There's shame rather than saying like, oh, this is a great opportunity to learn. Like we know that people learn things more effectively after they've made a mistake and then they correct it, right? That's how it sticks in your brain. We know all these things, but yet like in our society, like it's not necessarily encouraged to kind of explore, to talk about that. The same with the group work, like you have to be okay with being uncomfortable and having someone challenge what you say. And you might be like, yeah, you're right. Or no, you're wrong. And here's why. But it pushes you to, that discomfort pushes you to further elucidate your point.
Exactly. I used to have this conversation, just to piggyback on that for a second, with students would come to me who got, a C or a D even on a paper that I'd assigned. And they were distraught. And, I would try to say to them, look, if you could get an A on every assignment or an A in every course, the minute you walked in here, like we would just hand you your diploma and tell you to move on. Like, because there's nothing more for you to learn. You know it all, right? The point of college is that, of course, it's going to be challenging. You're almost certainly going to work harder to get top grades in college than you had to in high school, unless you went to an extremely rigorous high school, and some students will have. But by and large, college is going to be more challenging intellectually than high school was. And you have to assume that you're likely to work harder to get the same grades as you got in high school. And that's a good thing. That's what you're paying for. You're paying for an education.
Right. You're paying to get challenged. And but like our culture doesn't like, and I think this is I could go on for hours about this and how it's affecting teen mental health, but the fact that we're just like, oh, you need to get straight A's and take all the APs and be the captain of like the World Galactic Peace Society or whatever it is, that crazy thing that we're now expecting.
Yeah.
It's just, no one says like, well, yeah, there was this time when I tried playing the trumpet and I learned I was really terrible at it. And that's why I play the drums now. Like that's a perfectly acceptable course of events, but maybe not, the way that people view it in college admissions all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I definitely have to say that, even as an adult, I find that if I'm put in situations where I'm forced to learn things that I don't want to learn, it's amazing. So I'm helping out at my son's school. He's in, 5th grade, and after school they have this science and math and technology interest group, and so I'm basically there as crowd control because everyone else is scientists or computer programmers, and I'm just like, where are you going? And no, you can't go to the bathroom again, right? But I'm starting to learn through osmosis about coding and math, and it's just I learned the other day that I think like Python only has 33 words and that it knows, and yet you can build the most amazing things with that. And my mind was just blown. It made me want to start learning those words. So I think even as an adult, we have to challenge ourselves sometimes and put ourselves in places where it's not our area of expertise.
Absolutely.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
This is Linda, and this week's recommended resource is the website Chegg. Chegg is an online platform that provides resources and tools to help students succeed academically, but it's probably best known as a textbook rental service. Students can sometimes rent textbooks for a fraction of the cost of buying them new, which can equate to hundreds of dollars of savings each semester. Chegg also offers e-textbooks, which can be more affordable than traditional texts. Chegg also offers study tools to help support students in their courses. This includes online tutoring, study guides, and practice exams. They're now leveraging AI in their new personalized adaptive tutoring tool, Cheggmate, which as of recording is now accepting users on a wait list. Chegg also offers a plagiarism checker, which can help students ensure their writing is free from plagiarism, and a citation generator. They have a job and internship search platform to help students find opportunities in their field of study, and they have resources in their Career Center to help students prepare for the job market. These are just a sampling of the many tools available to students on Chegg. Start exploring at chegg.com.
So, what do you think are the most common mistakes that college students make, and what could they do to not make those mistakes?
Well, one of them you just touched on. I think one of the mistakes is perfectionism. I think assuming that the goal is to kind of assemble a perfect record or perfect GPA is a trap, and I think that students fall into that trap really easily. And in part, it's because of social pressures. In part, it's because of the intensity of the college admissions process itself, and how competitive it has become, especially at certain top schools. So, in a way, I think students have been kind of socialized to feel like the better they perform, the more successful they're going to be. And over again in college, I came across students who were just devastated the first time they failed at something because they thought their life was over, basically. I mean, I thought they just had never experienced that before, and it sort of shattered their sense of self self-worth or their sense of self-esteem, because they expected themselves to be able to do it perfectly. And if you could shed that and just accept your own humanity and the fact that everybody makes mistakes. I used to say to students sometimes, even the best professional baseball players ever, don't bat 1,000,
No,
like
they do not.
far from it. A really good baseball player, and I'm not a big baseball fan personally, but a really great baseball player is in the mid to high 300s, right? That's a great average, right?
Right.
Which means that you strike out a lot. And,
Right.
that's everybody does, even the very best people do. So, keep that mindset in mind. And I think it helps you both in terms of mental health, but also in terms of just your attitude toward learning. And so that's one thing that I think students often make it harder on themselves by not looking at that in a more realistic way.
Yeah, I think that's a huge problem, and I suppose college admissions certainly plays a large role in the whole process. I think that kids feel like it's sort of the presumption is that everyone can go to Stanford and everyone can go to Harvard, and you just have to work hard enough. And that's not really true, right? I mean, there's a lot of luck that goes into it, circumstance, what opportunities you might have had or might not have had. But people put the pressure on themselves as if those things didn't exist. And it was all about them and their ability and their hard work. And I think that does then just like learning is not even important in that. Achieving is important, and
That's
if we
right.
could just get back to learning, I think kids would feel so much better.
I absolutely agree. And talk about implications. One other implication of that, I think, or extension of that, has to do with the way people think about the purpose of college altogether. And I think increasingly students enter college, partly because of how expensive it is, enter college with a focus on what can I study that's going to get me a good paying job when I get out. And there's certainly nothing wrong with getting a good paying job, and I don't want to be interpreted in any way as suggesting that doesn't count. And particularly in many cases for students who are first generation college students, for whom their college is really a ticket to helping them and their families, move out of difficult circumstances into more comfortable circumstances. And that's a laudable goal, absolutely. And I also want to say that along with that, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book, that college is about learning how to think. The one thing, because the job that you think you're aiming for, may be your first job out of college. It may not last that long. You may discover that that information that led to that job is obsolete before long. What you want to do is think about your college education as a ticket to jobs that don't even exist yet, because you
Exactly,
want to be
exactly.
trained and prepared to think in the ways that will enable you to do any job better than the other person who's applying for the same job, right? Because that's your competition. And what you want to do is use your college education as a way to prepare you for the future, for a life that's going to be successful and meaningful in the broadest possible way, not in a very narrowly focused career or job related way. And I think students often make the mistake of imagining that college is really only about career preparation. And I think,
Right.
again, there are benefits to college, absolutely. There's lots of evidence that people who get college degrees have far higher lifetime earnings than people who don't. And at the same time, there's a lot more to college than just earning potential.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and that's sort of the intangibles that people you can't measure, your ability to think critically about a certain issue, like in a dollar sign or in any other kind of way. It's how you experience life and how you go through the world. And I think that is why taking things that you don't want to take and learning to think critically and to weigh evidence. I mean, that just, as you said, it helps in every aspect of your life, professionally, personally, and hopefully like societally as well. But yeah, I think that what you touched on, I mean, so many people are thinking that college isn't worth it now because they're looking at maybe as a vocational track or the dollar signs. And our society isn't emphasizing this other piece, right? Of how do you think and how do you be a person and how do you go through the world and be able to face different challenges, whether they're professional or personal. And I really wish we kind of started looking at that more.
Right. Right. And I'll just, again, piggyback on that a bit by saying that also skews people's interest in college often toward subjects that look like they have very direct channels, right, into particular kinds of careers, right? So if you're interested in being a doctor, you want to major in biology. If you're interested in being a lawyer, you might want to major in political science, right? Or right, if you're interested in being a psychologist, you might want to major in psychology, right? These are things that look very much like they are career tracks. Whereas, philosophy doesn't immediately lend itself to how are you going to make a living as a philosophy graduate? Right? But the reality is that in fact, the kinds of thinking that you learn how to do in a philosophy class could end up being extremely helpful. And a lot of businesses are very interested in people who can think about ethics and who can think about
Yes.
implications
Yes.
and who can think about comparing two ideas and two ways of looking at something and so forth. So the skills that you learn in those classes could turn out to be extremely useful and marketable if you thought about them that way, instead of just thinking
Right.
very
Right.
narrowly about what subject leads to what kind of career. And I need to find something that's very career focused. I'll tell you, and I'll tell your listeners, I had an occasion with early on in my time at Stanford, I had little focus groups that I gathered of students because I wanted to learn about their experience and just get to know them. And it was one way of kind of getting acculturated to Stanford was I spent time over dinner with a lot of different students. And I had students say to me things like, my parents have said, you know, you need to major in a STEM field, right? Science, technology, engineering, or math. You need to major in a STEM field, or I'm not going to pay for your education. And I thought to myself, how sad that the parents are sort of constraining their children's choices in that way, because their idea is that this education is only going to pay off if you take a very particular kind of course of study. Whereas in fact, you look at Stanford graduates who graduate in all sorts of other fields, they're all doing quite well. They all get jobs. They all, right? So, and that's, I don't want to be just Stanford specific, but it's also the case that, whatever college you go to, whatever degree you get, there are going to be opportunities for you to use that in productive ways. And you need some help maybe to figure out how to build on what you've already done and what you know. But ask most people these days, ask most 30, 40, 50-year-olds, like, what are you doing now and what relationship does it have to your college major? And the answer is almost always very little.
Yes.
Very
Yeah.
little connection, right? I got here through some circuitous route that had very little to do with what I majored in. So I would encourage, maybe that's another mistake I would identify. Students too often assume that their major is their destiny, career-wise, and it's just not true.
Yeah. No, I think those are all great points. I mean, one of the smartest people, I moved to Chapel Hill a couple years ago, that I have met was somebody who was helping me in the shoe store, and he was a senior at UNC Chapel Hill, and he was killing it with all of his dental school applications and getting it everywhere, but he was a comparative literature major. And just because he loved it, but he also wanted to be a dentist. And so he took all the other, prerequisites for dentistry. And, I think that made him a really distinctive candidate, in addition to doing what he loved for 4 years. So I thought he was great. And the shoes were awesome. Added bonus.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I will tell you, I mean, one of the things that I did at Stanford was oversee the people who did pre-professional advising, particularly pre-med and pre-law advising. And they would say regularly to students that, of course you need to take organic chemistry and all these math and physics classes and all the other things that medical schools expect you to have done before you apply to med school. But if you want to be a standout candidate, you might also want to have taken art history, because the ability to look at things closely and being able to, that kind of visual acuity is really important as a doctor. Or you might want to have majored in psychology, because actually, the ability to talk to people and understand them and relate to them is actually a pretty important part of being a doctor. And being able to talk about that on your med school application might actually set you apart from a lot of the other candidates who are just sort of mainstream, really good scientists.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, hopefully you heard the first part of Lisa and I talking about our visit to High Point in May. We'll continue now with our final part. Listen and enjoy. And one of the things that, I can't remember the name of the representative that we met with when we had our one-on-one. I know Jabari was our tour guide. Jonathan. Yeah. Both were graduates of Winston-Salem State University. Shout out to Stephen A. Smith. To get that in there. But, he said, and this is kind of your point, he said, they constantly get feedback that High Point graduates are just different. Like they know how to handle themselves in an office, in a boardroom, in that kind of environment. And when you look at all the things that they do, I think that should be a part of what a school does if it's preparing you for people.
And I think schools might do that implicitly, right? Like if you go to Harvard, I'm assuming, and you hang out with everybody, and many of these people are from, very successful families, and they, by imitating them and seeing what they do, you kind of figure out what you need to do. But the thing at High Point is it's taught to everyone at the school. Like once you get in there, you are going to learn that. And I think, that's important.
And just a couple other things that they do. One thing I like, you see the big vision there. I mean, law school, optometry, PA, engineering, nursing, like all this stuff. I mean, just it's incredible. But they have these things, like they have a program called Go Global. And basically in the month of May, you can go to all these partnerships they have all around the world and study in a program or area of your interest. And you get like $5,000 for that. All you have to do is get your way over there. I thought that was really, really cool. Another thing that I thought was awesome was if you major in communications or business leadership, you can get a free master's if you graduate. The only condition is that you have to stay on campus. You got to pay the on-campus fee, but it's not like Lakeside Village in Miami that's $23,300 for a dorm.
Really? That's how much that is?
Yes, I just did that big number. I just literally just recorded that.
Wow.
Just recorded it with Vince. That's you'll hear that when Vince and I when we go live.
That is insane. I thought Elon was a little bit,
no.
Crazy. Wow.
So, but that's amazing. And but even you can even kind of see their thinking. So this grew out of the pandemic. It grew out of the, they're like, there's losses, there's gaps. What can we do? And it's like, well, why don't we do a free online master's? And they're actually going to stick with that in perpetuity for those two programs. Now, right now, they're giving free MBA, free masters in biomed engineering sciences, some things. They said that's just for probably for 23 and 24. They've extended it to a lot of their master's programs for 2 years, but they're planning on sticking with it for business, leadership, and communications. And by the way, those are two of their marquee programs. Like if you ask them, like their top programs, they'll say, business and communications. Like they're very bullish about like where they think like nursing and some of these newer programs are going to be.
Yeah. That's what they're pushing into.
Yeah, they're pushing there, and I've always like the first thing I think of High Point, I think of business. Right. I always thought of business.
I mean, and they're very professional and practical, and that's kind of what they're doing. I don't think you're going to go in there and you're going to have lots of conversations about Foucault and Nietzsche and, the kind of education that I had. I don't know how much that good those things are doing me on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I wanted to say something about that. One of the questions I had, and probably still have a little, there's one area I'd like to learn more about, is how much critical thinking happens in the curriculum across the board. Like, there's a place for a transactional approach to education that's all about getting a job and being prepared. And there's another place for like blowing your mind and exposing you to all types of different thinking and stretching and growing you as a person. And when you heard them describe the honors college, that's exactly what they described, because they have an honors college.
Right.
Yeah, they have an honors college. They take 100 students that get into that honors college. And it's for students like with high GPAs, and they identify them right away. They say, hey, we encourage you to apply for honors as well as fellowship. And they said it's a completely different curriculum. And they said that multiple times. It's a completely different. And it really focuses on critical thinking. You stay 2 years together, all live in Finch Hall. You don't have to, but most people do. And it's structured, but you're together in this close-knit environment in the same classes. Like a lot of honors colleges, it's just they have you do an extra project and call it honors, and you're just mixed into the larger population. But this was real. So I know that all that high-level critical thinking is happening in honors. I'd love to know a little bit more about how much of it's happening in other parts of the curriculum.
Do all the things, right?
Yeah.
You have to make your choices. Now, but I wanted to say, this is what troubled me about High Point. So there's all these great things, but what troubled me about it is the fact, and this might be influenced by 2 or 3 days early, I just interviewed Evan Mandry. And, he has a very different philosophy of what public or just what college education should do. And, it just seems like if they invested more money, if they hadn't built the staircase that looks like the Titanic.
Doesn't look like. I think it was the original one that was actually in the movie that they brought over there.
Yeah. If they didn't have that, that couldn't have been cheap. It's got the chandelier and everything. They could have endowed a scholarship for poor kids, the president makes $3 million a year. If he took $1 million of that money and put it towards financial aid, that would make a huge difference. And that really, I think, would help their mission with the people who need it most, because frankly, people from wealthy families probably know how to do a lot of that stuff already because they live in that society. And
even if they don't, they have the network. You can call Uncle John and he gives you a job in the company or whatever.
Exactly.
Or take over the dad's firm or whatever. Yeah.
The people who need that, are people who aren't exposed to that in their everyday life.
So Lisa challenged them in our session, and I thought she did a good job challenging them on diversity, because I had that concern too, especially knowing kind of where they were. I was actually happy to hear of how much it appears to be on the radar. They did mention a number of things that they're trying to do, some diversity grants and scholarships, increasing need-based aid. And of course, with the 10% increase, they did put a lot more into need-based aid. But it seems to be very much an awareness that they are not where they need to be. And if they're going to be the world-class school they aspire to be, then they have to be strong at diversity. And so I was at least heartened by that response. But I came in with really low expectations in that area.
Oh yeah, I mean, and so like it's just even like the university itself is such a contrast to the town. I mean, the town is a very diverse town, and it's a relative. I mean, High Point really has fallen on hard times as people don't build furniture as much in North Carolina anymore. It's like built in China and it's shipped over here and you buy it on Amazon. It's a whole different model. And I know that the university is doing a lot of great things and employing a lot of people in the town. And I think that is, a really good, part of their mission that they're helping the town of High Point, but it doesn't reflect their local surroundings by any stretch of the imagination. Probably most people in that town can't afford to go to that school.
Now, one thing that I read, I didn't get this on tour, but I started reading afterwards. I was really fascinated by this place. But the president has already gotten $10 million gifts. So he knows how to like hobnob with the right people and shake the leaves.
$10 million and not even know I did it. I had it.
Oh, Lisa's rolling like that over there?
No, I'm just saying, what just happened? I just,
So it's a place, it's funny. I've been telling everybody since then, like, you just have to visit this place. Like, it's really like unlike anything you really ever seen. Like the opulence, the caliber, the facilities. But once again, like, I was impressed because I really felt like they were living their mission out and they were applying the excellent. I thought they were really, before they were all about just the pizzazz. And I didn't realize that there was a lot of substance underneath there. And the thing is, it takes a while to change your reputation of a school. Like, you think it's only been 18 years and they've gone from like 1,450 students and constantly under-enrolled and just really, really struggling to a place where, even when I interacted, like I can see their reach is really expanding. Right. I mean, their top states are New Jersey and New York, but they're pulling from Texas. Just the other day in Georgia, someone in front of me and at the Indian restaurant had High Point bumper sticker on in front of them. Like, I'm really seeing that. Like, where's this school going to be in 10 and 15 years?
Right. Well, and it just made me think about what does education need to be? Because again, like, my education, and of course this was like a zillion years ago, but like, the University of Chicago is pretty on the outside, but at that point it was like a dump on the inside. Everything was old. When I went to Northwestern, everything was old on the inside.
I'm just laughing because, Linda's got a daughter at the University of Chicago. Between Lisa and Dave cracking on the University of Chicago, what did I get myself into? Linda's always saying that.
No, it's probably really nice now. It probably really is. But this is 30 years ago. So that's what I associate with education, And so to me, to walk into some
Spartan.
Yeah, Spartan, and it's a life of the mind, man. And you got to suffer a little bit, and your chair's uncomfortable. And maybe you got to wear a short shirt. I don't know.
Sit in a hard chair.
Yeah, you sit in a hard chair and you think.
Toughen it up.
But I was walking through there. I'm like, well, I don't suppose being in a very nice place would make you any dumber. It probably wouldn't inhibit your learning. So, maybe that wasn't, I just always assume like that's a necessary part of education. And it's probably not.
So one thing I really like about them, and this was not anything that I heard, but I just picked it up. I guess I heard it implicitly. I see them as a place that would be constantly surveying everybody and listening and trying to improve. Like, if they're hearing that their graduates are not crushing it in any way, like whatever, like their writing skills were not at the level we expected, or they're, like, I see them going back and into the workshop and addressing that, like, you know what I mean?
Like yesterday. Yeah. And, a lot of like education is like, there's a lot of, well, that's the way we've always done it. So that's the way we're going to do it in education. There isn't a lot of innovation sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they have a lot of innovation.
It's about, when you talked about Rick Clark and institutional priorities and admissions, that's not just in admissions. That's throughout the whole educational experience. And so there are a lot of things that may not be ideal for students that are happening at schools, but they are not looking at it that way. There's like, these are our customers and these are our projects. We want our projects to be successful and our customers to be happy. So what do we need to do to make that happen? And if we have to change, then we'll change, which is a really novel thing, I think, when it comes to secondary education.
Yeah, so visit High Point. The dorms are extraordinary. The food is extraordinary.
Granite, stainless kitchens, folks.
All of that. But I think it's not just sizzle. There's substance there, especially if you're very ROI conscious and you're like, I want to make sure that I'm coming out with a job.
Yeah, and also, you're gonna, you might be the kind of person who you just feel like you'd be more successful in college if you had some support, and that was really built into the system. Then this could be a place to go. And if you don't really care about who Foucault is or what he wrote about, then you just want to go learn stuff to make money.
There's another thing that we didn't talk about that's important. Their teachers are there to teach. There's an emphasis on teaching, not research. In fact, not just that, they really emphasize that they're mentors. They're like, when we hire you, we expect you to be a mentor and a teacher. So the classes are small. There's no TAs. There's lots of interaction with students. And, I wish we could have sat in a class, Lisa. That's maybe we'll have to try to go back and do that in the future. That would be really fascinating.
Like an hour and 10 minutes away.
Yeah, so. It's really close to, especially, to where you live,
Yeah, so
not too far from where Joy lives.
And, come out of there like scramble. Whenever I need a little brain reset, I'm going to go hang out at High Point.
Well, you're fun to visit schools with. And so it was great to talk to you and then compare notes. So Elon's up next.
All right.
So, Lisa, I know you're getting used to being in all these crazy locations. I'm on the road. I'm in Tennessee. I'm at a timeshare, and I'm trying to create a little makeshift sound booth with cushions. So I'll let our listeners be the judge if it works.
Well, you don't have the blanket over your head. So.
Yes, never again. I love the podcast. I love our listeners, but everybody has their limits.
Yeah, not that much.
Coming out as a sweat hog after 30 minutes is too much. But I wanted to just record a little addendum to our High Point conversation. You know how you said your head is spinning and my head continued to spin. There's a couple questions I continue to really feel I want to dive deeper on it with High Point. And one of them is how much critical thinking is in the curriculum.
Right.
I'm not sure how much is there. I think it's there in that honors college. They emphasized it so much. It's a whole completely different curriculum. Part of when I was listening to Dr. Lewis Newman's book and your interview, I was wondering how High Point would measure up by those standards.
Yeah, it's hard to know. Not having sat in any classes, but they're sort of anti-intellectual in the sense that they are relentlessly practical and applied. And I'm not
Correct.
saying that those things are like the opposite, but I do think that there are some things that maybe don't have a practical application directly, but indirectly, like that style of thinking could have a lot of practical implications.
Yeah, and I also wonder to what degree individuality is allowed for versus this is what we do. It's careerism, just transactional. You come in here, you're going to end up with a great job. And so part of what I'm asking more questions than I'm giving answers now. I don't want listeners to make it feel like we feel we've totally got High Point figured out. Actually, what I want to do with you, I want to go back again and just I'm not going to leave until I talk to 25 students.
All right.
And I feel like that will be really helpful for us to just interview 25 students and then report back to our listeners what we learned from that.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds good?
That makes sense. I'll be prepped. I'll know what to expect.
Yeah, you won't get stunned.
I won't get stunned by High Point. It was their graduation, and so it was just extra crazy that day too. That's not their fault. Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's like sort of what is the purpose of college, right? I think there's a lot of us, maybe who would argue that part of college is to learn a lot about critical thinking and to kind of open your mind and do these sort of intellectually based exercises, which develop the skills that then you can apply practically. But I do think, I remember listening to this podcast and it was talking about how college doesn't necessarily respond to the market. And there was a designer at Nike, and he developed a design program where he took kids from the inner city. I think it was like 6 months or a year, taught them the skills that he thought that they needed to know to design shoes, and they've done extremely well. So there is something like, if you are looking for a job, to kind of retrofit the education back to the job. I mean, there's a validity, I think, to that style of education as well.
Yeah, nothing has changed my mind that it's a place that is great for a lot of people, and a place that I believe it has a bright future. And I think it's gonna be a much more of powerful, maybe too strong of a word, but highly desirable location in the next 10 to 20 years. I think the interest is going to grow. The reputation is going to grow. See, I don't take back anything that I said on that. The other thing that I wanted to share. So, I literally just got back from this Tennessee trip with 45 educational consultants and some school-based counselors. And I found two that had pretty extensive placement track record with High Point. And, had been there and had sent way more kids than, we've seen. And I picked their brains thoroughly. And the interesting thing is I got two completely different answers. So one was like, it's MAGA. It's like, like they felt like something we didn't feel like. I was like, so do you think it's like 80%, 100? It's another liberty. And they said it was very conservative and somewhat robotic. Although they respected a lot of the goals, they felt like it didn't have, much individuality. Then I spoke with another person, similar placements at the school, and they said, that's not true at all. She said, one of the students I sent there was very active in the Democratic Club, always wore the T-shirt, recruiting people, and had a fantastic experience there. And one thing that this person said in particular was something that you picked up, which is how phenomenal it is for learning differences. And they said, I've seen students go there that you wondered if they would get out of high school. And what they did was so transformational there. Like, they came out and they got great jobs, and they're doing really well in their jobs and careers. And I totally credit that, because these are some kids that I wondered if they were even college ready. And now they have like these great jobs, and she totally credited it to High Point's, work with the students.
Right.
And so I wanted to just bring that lens. It's a little bit different than just our observational lens, but it is conversations with a couple of people that have significant High Point placement. They disagreed on the political part, and that probably partly reflects their own politics. I think one was really probably far left, and the other was not right. The other one was center left. So they were center left, and they still felt it's a place that has political diversity. I also want to really look at the curriculum, Lisa, before we do our update. I'd like to know if there's teaching about the pitfalls and weaknesses of capitalism, or the role America has played that's oftentimes been exploitive or hypocritical when it comes to American Indians, Mexican Americans, Black Americans, Japanese, women. Or is it all sort of just genuflecting at how great the red, white, and blue is, and a shrine to American capitalism, and dissenting voices are not welcome or seldom found? Those are the kinds of things that show me critical thinking's in the curriculum. Alternative voices. Yeah. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I just thought I'd share that, just because I want to make sure that we really are fair to any school that we discuss, even if we've spent 4 or 5 hours on a campus.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think that, I don't know about I didn't poll people, I just think that there are some like triggers, like the giant flag and, God, country. Those words are like triggers to, I think, people who are liberal at this point,
I think that's fair, Lisa, because the one person at Center Point, they said the motto's God, family, country, for crying out loud. Like,
right.
They actually,
that's triggering. And it's not there's anything wrong with God, family, or country, or the American flag for that matter. It's just like somehow it's been conditioned as like, now that's like a scary thing.
Sure.
So I don't know if that, just because they have that doesn't mean that are like intuitive heuristic of yikes is really accurate. And I did not find it to be accurate.
No, I didn't find it either.
I was on the campus. I guess I would just say that this is something I think about a lot. Like, the reason why High Point can do so well with students with learning differences is it throws a ton of resources and attention at them. And it's transformational. And I just think as a society, we need to be thinking about things more that way. I read this article about this small town in Ohio, and the kids were not doing well in school, and they got a grant, and they just threw all kinds of services at these students, and they are doing so much better. The families are doing better. I mean, it's really just kind of an argument for having a highly resourced approach to certain problems.
And we found the same thing there with their overall like their career counseling. Like, if you're not sure what you want to study, they're very good at providing that. And so, I just thought I'd record a few more thoughts and having a chance. It's been, Elisa and I are recording this on June 10th, 11th.
It's like,
June 11th,
whatever day it is.
And we were there on May 3rd. So it's been 6 weeks reflection back. So that's all. This is not to contradict anything I've said, but sometimes you'll hear people say that place is a cult, and I feel that's too strong language.
Right.
But I want to go back with you again and just talk with people, because that's the best way that I know to just get that complete immersion. Because sometimes, admissions people, things just are put through a bit of a marketing filter. And so it's just completely unfiltered. So let's do it and report back.
Absolutely.
I'm always coming your way with my daughter there, getting there at least once or twice a year.
Just let me know. We'll set it up.
Sounds great. Thanks, Lisa.
This Monday, Mark will share some bonus content. Then Lisa will interview Irina Smith, the former Stanford admission officer, on her book, The Golden Ticket: A Life in College Admission Essays. That will be part 1 of 3.
And friends, remember, it's not where you go. It's not where you go. It's not where you go, but it's what you do when you get there. And it's what you do when you get out of there.
See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us, and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.